Hey, it's Simon. Welcome to Book 2 of the Lethal Rain series. I hope you're ready for the next installment of this weather control apocalypse. Some of you have been asking me about the direction of this story. Since I never give anything away ahead of time, all I can say is that you simply won't believe what's about to happen. It's going to shock you, taking you places you never thought possible. How's that for a cryptic response? As a former intelligence officer, you really didn't expect anything else, did you? I didn't think so. Okay, it's time to dive into part 2, but before we do, don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. We'd appreciate it.
Chapter 1. General Nate Rawlings doubled his grip on the handrail of the speeding boat Reliance as its Coast Guard crew raced him across the wind-driven fetches of the Atlantic Ocean. The newly christened Defender boat was the latest in a new line of crime-fighting speed demons patrolling the water around the nation's capital, and the only ride available for this urgent open-water meeting.
"First time on a Defender-class boat, General?"
Captain Hastings asked, his eyes sharp and focused.
"Yes, first time,"
Rawlings answered, trying to keep his feet on the deck as the boat went airborne over the next swell. His stomach was already turning flips, and they'd only been on the water for 45 minutes. He made a mental note to drag Director of National Security Nancy Wiggins along for the next ride if she ever arranged another meeting like this on the ocean. If he had stopped to think about the rough ride and how it would inflame the constant stabbing pain in his stomach, he never would have requested to meet with the CEO of Nighthawk Services, Blake Anderchuk, and certainly never would have agreed to do so offshore. The general turned his focus to Captain Hastings.
"What's the Reliance's top speed?" "Had her up to 70 yesterday, but the seas were calm. A little slower today, I'm afraid. I wish we could give you a better ride, General, but if we're going to get you there on time, we have to push it, sir."
"I understand, Captain. Do what you need to do, but please, call me Nate. We can dispense with the formalities if you don't mind. At the end of the day, we're all on the same side and answer to President Cooper, regardless of rank or service. I'm sure neither of us wants to be here right now, as there are more pressing issues to deal with. We're just two honorable men enjoying a leisurely ride on the open water." The captain nodded, but didn't respond. His eyes turned to the glass window in front of him, darting in random directions as if he was thinking the request over.
"Sounds like you can outrun almost anything on the high seas,"
Rawlings asked him, testing to see if he'd just insulted the captain. Some career men couldn't handle a lax atmosphere when a general was standing near, but Rawlings preferred it that way. It helped him gauge a new acquaintance by freeing the officer's personality a bit.
"Affirmative, sir. General. Sorry, Nate. That's why the Reliance was built. Drug runners have been giving us the slip with their top-end craft, but not anymore. ETA to the Octopus, 10 minutes.
Ever seen the Octopus up close?"
"Negative, but I've heard rumors. Biggest civilian yacht ever built, if memory serves."
"That she is. 414 foot with a full-time crew of 57. I hear it's one hell of a party boat."
"Must have cost a small fortune,"
the captain said, as if the shackles of decorum were starting to loosen. The general preferred to save the formalities of command for the men directly under his watch, and, of course, for when he needed to deal with the political types in Washington. Not when chatting with a Coast Guard captain who was stuck playing taxi driver for a day. Nate smiled. "Actually, a large fortune, if the reports are correct. Anderchuk spent over $200 million, all cash."
"Cash?"
"There's a significant profit in DoD contracts these days, especially now that Nighthawk doesn't have much in the way of competition," Nate informed him, thinking of Simon Redfall's bankrupt company, Ghostworks.
"I can't fathom that kind of money."
The general shook his head, slowly. "I'm afraid it's only a pipe dream for us working stiffs."
"Roger that,"
Hastings said, reviewing some paperwork just handed to him by a junior officer. He signed off and gave the clipboard back to his man, who turned and walked away crisply. Nate checked his watch and ran a quick calculation. "Looks like we'll arrive just under the wire. The Octopus is scheduled to set sail for 3 months at the top of the hour."
"Where to?"
the captain asked. "Spain, Cape Town, Sydney, Honolulu, then San Francisco, assuming Anderchuk doesn't alter his itinerary."
"What's he doing way out here?" Deep-sea fishing with a couple of U.S. senators before taking them on a world tour. Being a politician certainly has its perks. If they're planning to go ashore, I hope they brought plenty of umbrellas. That red rain is relentless. At least out here, we can escape it for a while. True, but I doubt there will be many excursions ashore. Like I said earlier, the Octopus is one hell of a party boat. I imagine there's plenty of young scenery aboard as well, so no reason to disembark, if you know what I mean. Alcohol, girls, and politicians. Sounds like tabloid trouble to me. You married, Captain? Kids? Yes, 11 years. We have 2 sons, Jake and Ellis. They play any sports? Hastings shook his head. Not yet, but both are huge Redskins fans. So am I. Me too. Though, since everything went pay-per-view, it's just not the same as the old days when you could attend the game in person. While I enjoy sitting in my chair at home with a cold one, you just can't feel the speed and power of the game when it's on TV. Octopus in sight, sir, Hastings reported, pointing with his left hand. Port side, 10 o'clock. Excellent work, Hastings. You ever met Anderchuk, the former F-16 pilot? No, sir, I haven't, but I've read his book, An Aviator's Confession. Interesting read, though I'm not sure his squadron was too happy about it. Rawlings shot him a look that said continue, but didn't respond. In it, he talks about how he earned his call sign, Nighthawk. It was during a naming ceremony held by the squadron's social chairman for some new arrivals, including Anderchuk. There were a bunch of pilots drinking and blowing off steam when 2 girls arrived and started dancing together. If I remember correctly, they were twin sisters, a couple of blonde strippers hired to entertain for the night. Apparently, a long-standing tradition for their namings. Sounds like a tradition I'd like to be invited to. I'm sure it was a wild night. Hastings nodded. Absolutely. His book didn't go into a lot of specifics about the girls' act, but he did mention his call sign was given to him after he and his tongue completed a daring set of maneuvers involving multiple angles of attack with the twins. Rawlings smiled, appreciating the carefully chosen words. Multiple angles of attack? Interesting use of the term. That's how he put it in the book. Anyway, the novel went on to say that his maneuvers gave a new meaning to the aviation term track crossing angle, but the rest of the details were omitted. Nate laughed, enjoying the banter with the captain. Hastings continued, changing his tone to one of familiarity. Anderchuk said he achieved a successful firing solution, which I guess brought the house down and led to his dubious call sign. Nate laughed again, this time hard enough to bother the knot in his stomach. He ignored the pain. If the rest of his book is this good, I'll bet it was a bestseller. Yeah, it was highly recommended on Amazon. That's why I ordered it. Glad I did. You read a lot, Hastings? Every chance I get. It's the best way to pass the time between shifts. I prefer autobiographies. Why? When they're done well, they draw me in like I'm seeing it all happen right in front of me. I get lost in the pages for hours. I've never been much of a reader, though I've been known to down my share of booze and get a table dance or two. But that's a discussion for another time, my young friend. Looks like we're here, Nate told the grinning captain as the Defender boat slowed, pulling around to the back of the massive yacht. Do you need a detail to accompany you, sir? The captain asked as the 2 boats touched gently for the first time. No, you may stand down, Captain. Wait here while I meet with Anderchuk. Won't take but a few minutes. Copy that. Chapter 2. Have a seat, General. Would you like a drink? Blake Anderchuk asked from his favorite cushion in the plush lounge of the newly purchased mega yacht, Octopus. The Nighthawk CEO was curious as to the nature of this surprise meeting with General Rawlings, a man he'd never met before today. Director Wiggins didn't go into detail, only telling him that it was Priority 1. Call me Nate, the dark-skinned man said, sliding his plus-size frame onto the couch. When his guest made eye contact, Anderchuk continued. We've stocked just about everything you could want, even some of the exotic brands, Blake said, waving at his personal assistant, Patricia, who was standing in the doorway, wearing a skimpy red bikini and a devilish smile. The 100-pound brunette, who had perfect curves and a submissive personality to match, came over and stood next to him, waiting for orders like she'd been trained.
Blake planned to savor her sweetness later, after the conclusion of this unexpected visit from General Rawlings.
Just name it, Nate, and Patricia here will fetch it for you. Anything at all. We have beer, wine, and the hard stuff. Plus, I can bring some of the girls down too, if that's more to your liking. Most of them are former NFL cheerleaders who lost their job when the NFL was forced to close their public stadiums and hold secluded pay-per-view games. Can't blame them either. Not after the bloody ISIS attacks on the games in Baltimore, Washington, and Philly.
I remember that Sunday well, Rawlings said, with a downtrodden tone in his voice, shaking his head.
Yes, a horribly dark day in our nation's history. As businessmen, though, the NFL owners had to press on and do what they needed to do to keep the cash flow rolling in and the doors open. Though I think the president could have handled the proportional response better. Every last one of my men were standing by, willing to send a much stronger message. But the orders never came through, he said, hoping to pry a reason out of the general.
The man sat quietly, so Blake decided to move on.
Regardless, I think you'll like the quality and attentiveness of my crew, if you know what I mean. I only hire the best.
Thanks for the offer, but I'll pass, Rawlings said, looking around.
Where are the senators? I'm sorry, who?
Senators Lusk and Martin, both from the Armed Services Committee. I was told they were on board to do a little deep-sea fishing before your world tour begins.
I'm not sure where you're getting your information, Nate, but I can assure you there are no members of Congress aboard right now. Just me and my all-female crew, plus a few dozen seagulls staining my decks. Patricia likes to call them sky rats, shitting on everything and everyone, he said with a smirk. If ammo wasn't at such a premium right now, I'd teach the girls to shoot, using the birds as target practice.
Blake studied the intense commander, who didn't respond, realizing his attempt at humor wasn't cutting through the general's hardened exterior. It seemed odd that Rawlings told him to call him Nate earlier. Most of the officers he'd met and served under were sticklers about such things, not wanting to expose even a sliver of their personal side. Perhaps, with all the stunning beauties on board, the man was trying to play it cool, but to what end, he couldn't be sure. So he continued.
However, the part you mentioned about the world tour is correct.
Rawlings grabbed his gut and grimaced, his face looking pale and numb. The man's chest started to heave in short bursts as the boat rocked with more intensity than before, rolling to port, then to starboard, and back again. Rawlings grabbed the couch with both hands, clenching his jaw.
Are you okay, Nate?
Blake asked, wondering if he should have a puke bucket brought in.
That remains to be seen. The ride here was a little rough, to say the least. Plus, I think I ate something earlier that didn't agree with me.
Blake had forgotten how easily the sea could wreak havoc with the uninitiated. It wasn't a problem for him or the members of his former squadron when they came to visit, but of course, they were all well-trained fighter jocks who could pull near-fatal Gs when engaging in combat maneuvers. Nothing affected them, except quality booze and friendly girls, both of which the octopus served up liberally. He caught Patricia's eye with a firm look. She bent down to expose her ample cleavage, bringing her ear next to his lips. I need you to go grab some Dramamine from Doc Brown. Wake up the old drunk if you have to, then send down Stacy and Dawn. Looks like our guest could use a little TLC.
No, I'm fine. That won't be necessary, Rawlings said in a commanding tone. No booze, no broads, no Dramamine. As you wish, General, Blake said, gesturing to Patricia to leave the room.
She nodded, then stood with perfect posture on her sculptured legs and manicured feet. A quick turn and saunter to the door caught the attention of the general. His eyes locked on to the sexy sachet of her hips as she breezed past him. She went through the door and disappeared in a flash.
An amazing creature, isn't she?
Blake asked his guest.
Yes, she is, Rawlings said with a stammer, swallowing hard as a fleshy bulge raced down his gullet. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, swaying in the seat. It helps you if you keep your eyes closed or stare at the end of your nose, Blake said, waiting to see if the man's color would improve. It didn't. I'll be fine, the man said, taking in a long breath. Let's stay on point.
Blake knew from experience when a commanding officer used that tone, he was about to either rip you a new asshole for a recent failure or ask the impossible. If the latter, it usually meant sending in a squad on a high-risk assignment.
Director Wiggins said you needed to speak with me. What can I do for you today, General? I understand you have a tactical unit stationed near Wilmington. Yes, an Alpha 1 assault team. Bruce Tanner is the field commander. Recently promoted. Good man.
Rawlings leaned forward slightly and let out a shallow burp, then narrowed his eyes as they found their way to Blake.
We need Nighthawk to bring in a former operator of ours from a farm in Lancaster County. Who's the target? Simon Redfall. As in Tessa Jane, the convicted terrorist? Let me assure you, she was no terrorist, and he's no target. In fact, this is a simple meet and greet to determine if he'll agree to come in and help us with another, more pressing matter. I suppose we can handle that, Blake said in a curious tone.
He wondered why his company was being sent on such a mundane mission.
Look, I know your company's reputation, Anderchuk. I don't need your men going in hot and escalating tensions. These are American civilians, and I need them treated as such. They have rights, and there's to be no collateral damage. Am I making myself clear? Yes, General, perfectly, but I'm sure you realize my men are usually tasked with more specific missions, those with a clear objective and authorization to engage. Don't you have your own men for a simple recovery like this?
We do, but Director Wiggins and I want this handled off-book. This is a private matter, and we need it done quietly and efficiently. Can I count on your complete discretion?
Certainly, whatever you need. NSG stands at the ready to assist,
Blake answered, hearing the roar of a jet fly by. The walls shook, and so did the floor panels, indicating the plane was flying low. Chapter 3. Zeke Olson sat forward in the desk chair of the safe house, leaning in to gaze at the wall-mounted view screen with a tighter focus. An ocean scene was playing on it, showing a boat in the distance. His recluse of a boss, Vito Indigo, continued the discussion across the video line.
See that yacht?
Damn, it's huge, Zeke answered, marveling at the size of the vessel.
That's the Octopus. I sold it recently for $200 million.
Wow, it's a beauty, he answered, watching the video feed change, banking left as Indigo's plane swung around for another pass above the white-capped seascape. When the jet flew closer, the screen zoomed in to show a swatch of topless girls lying on deck, their bodies tanned and breasts perfect.
Damn,
he said, fumbling his thoughts and words as his brain tried to process the stunning vision.
Not how I chose to spend my days at sea when I owned her, but I guess to each their own, Indigo said.
Who owns it now, boss?
Blake Anderchuk, CEO of Nighthawk.
Seriously? He can afford $200 million?
That's only a drop in the bucket when you're the go-to guy for the DoD. Their contracts offer endless cash flow with little accountability.
Zeke appreciated the history lesson, but wasn't sure where Vito was going with this exposé. Indigo rarely spent time on frivolities, meaning there was a specific business purpose behind this conversation.
Can I ask why you're showing me this?
Hold on, Vito said, as the display changed to show the rear of the boat.
Recognize that?
Yeah, looks like the Coast Guard. What is this, some kind of drug bust? Are they going to impound the boat? Zeke asked, figuring Vito might be thinking about buying the boat back at government auction.
No, actually, it's our government conspiring with the contractor.
To what end, sir?
Domestic security. Illegal domestic security, to be exact. Something that should never be allowed under any circumstances. This country was founded on a set of core principles. Principles that America's forefathers felt to be so damn important, they used them as the chief cornerstones of the budding nation. If the government chooses to ignore the Constitution's core values and beliefs, then everything that makes this country great will slowly erode until it disappears into the sands of time. Americans will become no different than the Neanderthals who occupied this planet long before modern civilization rose to prominence.
Zeke was impressed by Vito's eloquence and sudden flush of patriotism. Indigo continued with more power in his voice.
Mark my words, Zeke. Someday soon, historians will look back and point to a single man and his desire to be king. They'll scour the actions taken by Obama during his 2 terms as president and ultimately declare that the barrage of executive orders he signed in 2016 was the tipping point, not just for the United States, but for the world. Executive orders which, by their very nature, bypass Congress and the Constitution. His power-grabbing end run has led to everything we see happening today.
It wasn't Zeke's nature to question his boss, but a string of words flew from his lips before he could stop them. How do you know they're conspiring with a contractor?
I have ears and eyes everywhere. So does the NSA. Never forget that, Zeke. Someone is always watching. Always. Never take your eye off the ball for a second. It can cost you everything.
Zeke nodded, filing away his boss's warning while the maritime visuals played on the screen in front of him. The plane screamed past the boat again before banking around for yet another pass.
Are you planning to expose the conspiracy, boss?
Before Vito could answer, a horrific noise came through the video link. He saw a momentary flash of red on the screen before the camera view of the yacht changed, showing a rapid descent toward the ocean. Then the connection dropped.
Vito!
Zeke screamed, realizing his boss's plane had just exploded and crashed into the ocean. General Rawlings ignored the seasickness swelling in his gut as he followed Blake Anderchuk up the stairs to the main deck, then forward to the bow. They'd just heard what sounded like an explosion, and the girls on deck started screaming.
Make a hole,
Anderchuk said, weaving his way through the gaggle of whimpering eye candy who were huddling together at the front of the boat, all of them still topless after their leisure time on deck was violently interrupted.
Oh my God,
one of the girls said, crying a river of tears into the shoulder of another.
We have to do something,
a second one said as Nate pushed his way through the herd. He found Anderchuk with his hands gripping the upper arms of the tallest blonde.
What happened, Stacy?
Blake asked the hysterical woman whose hands and legs were shaking.
The jet. It turned and then just exploded,
she said with quivering lips and a face covered in tears.
Those poor people. What's happening, Blake? Did someone shoot it down? Why did it explode?
I don't know, Stace, Blake answered, standing tall as she flew into his arms, pressing her bare chest into his, wrapping herself in his arms. Rawlings stood next to Anderchuk, both of them gazing out at the open water. The Coast Guard boat Reliance roared past the octopus on the port side, powering its way through the uneven seas. Dead ahead of it, maybe a mile away, was a trail of lingering black smoke. It showed a descent trajectory that ran from the upper right part of the sky to the lower left, ending where an intense fireball was burning across the water. There were also 3 smaller offshoots of smoke in the sky, angling down toward the sea in random directions. Some of the wreckage was still visible, the tip of a wing, the middle section of the fuselage, and the entire tail assembly with its aircraft registration number still visible above water. Each piece was bobbing like an abandoned buoy.
Do you think anyone survived?
Stacy asked Blake. He didn't answer, and Rawlings knew why. The answer was clearly no. Not with the sea on fire, and the shredded remains of the jet disappearing into the depths below. Chapter 4.
Just under 11 clicks remaining to Old Mill Road,
Bruce Tanner told his second-in-command, Larry Fritz, watching the man's hands work the command vehicle's steering wheel. The Nighthawk team was well into their unauthorized mission to recover the missing weapons and ammo, closing in on the rural address where the shipment had been delivered by UPS.
Let's hope we don't run into any more accidents like the last one. We're fortunate emergency crews weren't on scene yet. Otherwise, someone would have started asking a lot of questions about our little convoy,
Fritz said, decreasing the speed of the SUV. Tanner agreed, but didn't answer. He looked at the road ahead. It was clear. He shot his driver a firm look.
Why are we slowing? Shouldn't we stop to apply the ATF signs on our side panels? Not yet. We'll take care of that a mile out. I don't want anyone to know an ATF assault team, albeit a fake one, is in the area. There are militia camps sprinkled all around this area, and I don't want to raise the alert level. They may not get along with each other, but I'm sure if they knew we were coming, they'd band together against a common foe, us. We need the element of surprise on our side.
Roger that, the driver said, pressing on the accelerator. Tanner's RAC headset crackled, and a voice spoke to him in the earpiece. It was HQ's Senior Communications Officer, Derek Prescott, calling on a secure frequency.
Eagle 1, Eagle 1. Eagle 1, this is Liberty Base. Eagle 1, this is Liberty Base. Over. Eagle 1 here. Go ahead, Liberty Base.
Tanner answered, wondering if HQ had discovered the missing shipment as well. If so, he was screwed for not calling it in immediately.
Tracking shows your present location in western PA. Confirm?
Prescott asked in a terse voice.
Affirmative. Unscheduled training up. Showing initiative. Over. Need you to deploy. Immediate. Over. 10-4. What's the target? Over. Farmhouse on Bell Tower Lane. Sending coordinates and mission specs now. Verify. Roger. Stand by.
Tanner said, waiting for the vehicle's encrypted action system to display the destination and orders. It did, showing the name and photo of one Simon Redfall, the disgraced CEO of their former rival, Ghostworks, LLC. He took a minute to read the mission specs and rules of engagement as they scrolled into view.
Received and verified, Liberty Base,
Tanner said in his radio voice.
Eagle 1 is Oscar Mike. Over. Copy that. Liberty Base out.
Simon Redfall stood next to Tally Wiki, a.k.a. Wix, as they both watched the young genius, G, work the virtual keyboard like a magician. The hands of the computer whiz were moving so quickly, Simon couldn't follow the entries. Not that he had the technical expertise to understand what the kid was doing anyway. G and the rest of the younger generation called the new virtual interface twipping, but the movements looked like something else entirely to Simon. They blended together into a visual blur, reminding him of a hummingbird's wings in mid-flight, not the jerky finger motions of a teenage human being. Yet, the tech maestro wasn't the most impressive thing Simon had seen since Wix led him into the basement of her prepper camp in rural Pennsylvania, which she affectionately called Pandora. The cramped, poorly lit room was the size of a single-car garage and was stacked with racks of blinking servers and whirring cooling fans. The equipment housed an almost endless amount of high-value intelligence data that had been stored on rugged, solid-state drives. G's revolutionary software program, nicknamed Digger, had done all of the collecting. Digger, the autonomous infiltrator bot, had been quietly combing systems all over the planet, mostly targeting big corporate server farms, government intelligence databases and archives, and scientific research firms. Digger was busy crawling in and around their database files to sift out data related to the global conspiracy that Wix had first mentioned in the van when they'd met. The same day Simon's wife was executed, and the same day the red rain started falling. Simon knew that somewhere in this bank of equipment was information on his wife. A big part of him wanted to know whether Tessa was truly guilty or not, but the other part, the part filled with suffocating regret, wasn't going to allow it. Knowing or not knowing wasn't going to change anything, other than to justify his own boiling hatred toward himself. She would still be dead, and he would still be the asshole who did nothing to save her from a brutal murder witnessed by the entire planet on pay-per-view. He changed focus, wanting to drive the pain from his heart and offer something of value to the living, something he could control, and something that would allow him to begin repairing the damage within his own heart. Simon tapped G on the shoulder and waited until the kid stopped his finger twipping before he spoke.
"How long has Digger been running?" Simon asked him.
"Ever since we brought this server farm online. It's fully automated, and I've built in some really cool voodoo. It learns as it crawls, discovering and defeating new security protocols using a multi-block heuristic look-ahead algorithm that I developed when I was 12.
What does that mean in English? You know, for those of us without a PhD and geek?
G smiled. It's simple, really. Digger launches a swarm of ghost penetrator attacks from all over the planet using a host of proxy servers that Digger has already compromised. And trust me, there are millions of them. Easy pickings for those with the right voodoo. Digger's gotten into all kinds of things, even a few of the IRS's systems. Want to know how much money the president's mistress made last year?
Not really.
Jeez, some people are such a buzzkill.
You were saying?
I was saying, while the target system is busy reacting and defending with its sentry programs, Digger watches and learns, then maps the response times and defense mechanisms used, finding the weakest entry point for the subsequent penetration. I call it optimal breach analysis, or OBA for short.
That's the English version? Simon asked.
G rolled his eyes. Think of it this way, Red. If a man, such as yourself, is surrounded by a gang of vigilantes in an alley and has to fight them all off at once, his back will always be turned to at least one of them, right? He can't defend all the angles, no matter how good he is.
Okay, that makes sense, he told the kid, remembering the painful beating in the alley by the NEC after his wife's execution.
When his back is turned, he can't see what's happening behind him, and that makes him extremely vulnerable to blindside attacks. The same thing can be said for any firewall appliance or sentry program. It's all about swarm intelligence and the vectoring algorithms used. That's what Digger launches, then studies the responses for weaknesses.
Isn't he amazing? Tally asked, looking like a proud mother. That's one word you could use, Simon said with a smirk.
Got it, G reported. Wyatt's gun shipment was sent by a company called Devil Dog Supply, some LLC based in Prescott Valley, Arizona.
The United States of Arizona, my grandpa used to say, where they still have all their gun rights, Wicks added. Everybody conceals and carries in the desert.
G continued. And the shipments were supposed to be delivered to a warehouse address in Willington.
How did you find all this? Simon asked, wanting to be sure he could rely on the young genius and the accuracy of his voodoo.
Well, I started by jacking into the UPS shipping database to find the records that matched the tracking numbers that Wyatt gave us. All it took was a simple SQL query. That was the easy part. But after closer inspection, I noticed the last update timestamps were off on each record. They weren't in the same numerical order like the tracking numbers, and they should have been. The only way that can happen is when someone changes the records after the fact, giving the changed record a newer timestamp. So I pulled up the previous week's database from cloud storage where UPS dumps all their backups. Inside the backup copies were the original unchanged records. Once I had them, it was easy to compare the two and spot what happened.
Which was? Simon asked.
Someone with super user access went in and changed the shipping records to redirect the shipment to Wyatt's compound. It never ceases to amaze me. Hackers always forget about the backups. Gotta change both sets of copies to fully cover your tracks. Stupid dumbasses.
Nice work, G.
But that's not all. The same super user also changed a bunch of other shipments from Devil Dogs, routing them to locations all around the country, including our friends in York County.
Which friends? Wicks asked.
The ones you hate the most, G said.
Damn it. The Carnegie brothers, Wicks told Simon. Looks like we were right. Simon nodded. Someone is deliberately pitting factions against each other.
Except their shipment was much smaller than Wyatt's. Not sure what that means, G said.
It means someone wants to control the outcome by arming one side better than the other, Simon said. Who would do this, and why? She asked. The why is easy. To create anarchy in the streets. But I don't think an uprising is the true endgame. Skirmishes between groups won't last long. Though it does make sense to arm all sides and then sit back and let them kill each other. It would set a precedent and establish a need for the president to declare martial law across the country. The media and the public would demand it at that point. Then Washington could send in law enforcement with the backing of the military to collect all the guns and ammo and arrest whatever bodies were still breathing. Nobody would think twice about the presence of tanks, troops, or rocket launchers stationed across the country.
Use the military on Americans? G asked. Isn't that against the law?
Laws can be suspended or changed in a time of crisis. Of course, they could also send in private contractors who work for the DHS and the DoD. Something my company used to do, Simon said, thinking of Ghostworks Fall and Nighthawk's Rise. But we still don't know who? G asked. My guess, it's someone who would benefit financially from all of this. Or it's simply the plan of a madman, wanting it all to burn, Simon explained, wanting to know more about the orders. G, can you find out who ordered the shipments from Devil Dogs in the first place? There's a significant amount of money behind this, so the trail has to lead somewhere. Check credit cards, Bitcoin, Zipcash, and bank transfers. The amounts would be huge and should jump off the ledger. Sure, give me a minute, G said, twipping away at his equipment. Simon turned to Wicks. I take it none of this was uncovered during your research efforts into the global conspiracy?
No, nothing like this. We were tracking scientists who had gone missing or turned up dead, plus large-scale shipments of exotic chemicals in unmarked trucks and ocean containers. Do you think the guns and ammo shipments are connected?
Probably. The timing is more than coincidence, leading me to believe there's a master plan at work here, probably reaching the highest levels of office, since it would take an enormous amount of money, power, and influence to pull this off. Then, if we throw in the red rain, something big is heading our way. That much is clear.
Your old friend Hansen?
For some of it, sure. But he'd need help for the rest. We could be facing a group of people wanting chaos in the streets.
Chapter 5.
Hey, look at this, G shouted. The money trail leads to an offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands, but the name on the account was scrubbed after thousands of wire transactions cleaned it out. This time, the hacker remembered to change the backup copies, too.
So it's a dead end, Simon said, hoping to keep the young computer genius calm and focused.
Not exactly. I was able to trace a few more of the activities by the same superuser, but I'm not sure what it all means. Why would someone send hundreds of military-grade microwave emitters to cell towers all around the world?
What? Are you sure about that? Simon asked, staggered by the revelation.
Positive. Digger has tracked manifests involving Raytheon and the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research.
I don't understand, Wicks told Simon.
It's called an active denial system. A mobile, truck-mounted energy weapon developed for non-lethal crowd control. It's silent and quite effective.
Why send the emitters to cell tower locations? Wicks asked, looking at G.
G pinched his face, then swung his head to give a worried look to Simon. Cell towers use directional beams. If the emitters were hooked up to the tower's transmitter array and blasted across the country, it could be used for crowd control. Or the emitters could be mounted on the towers themselves. Let's face it, who really knows what all the equipment is being used for? You've seen them. The towers are covered with equipment, just sitting out there, aimed in all directions. Nobody would ever notice new stuff being added.
They must be expecting a widespread uprising or something, Wicks said.
I'm not so sure about that, Simon said. Widespread use doesn't make sense. The system is designed to push a crowd back, but if you use it everywhere, where's the crowd being pushed back to? True, but what if they decided to crank up the juice to full power? Wouldn't it cook us all like lobsters? G asked. The kid was exaggerating a bit, and Simon wanted to slow him down. Okay, let's think about that for a moment. Why kill everyone? There'd be no way to control it once it was unleashed. I can see targeting specific groups, but not everyone. Even animals and livestock would be affected. In fact, every living creature would be at risk, from birds to bees. Except fish, since the emitter burst wouldn't happen over the ocean. Yes, but regardless, the food chain would crumble, leaving us all to starve, including the persons behind this. Unless, of course, they are living offshore somewhere.
Where the red rain isn't, Wicks added, interrupting Simon, using a more serious voice than before.
She locked eyes with G for a few moments, then turned them at Simon.
Maybe the storms are the key, part of all this somehow.
Simon took a moment to think. Red rain, affecting the major land masses only. Microwave emitters, cell towers, arming of militias. They were all related somehow, but he couldn't quite put the pieces together. Not yet. Something was missing. Gee, how many emitters were shipped? He asked. Hang on, the kid said, twipping his fingers and hands. Looks like only a handful to each state in the U.S. Same abroad. They're spread out geographically. Can you show me on a map? Sure, one sec. G answered, working his magic. The screen changed to show a map of the USA with red dots appearing across it like virtual pushpins.
The dots represent the addresses where the emitters were delivered. Some of them are bound to be rural, so we'll need to allow a couple of miles either way to where the cell tower is actually located. But the map is reasonably close. I'd say plus or minus 5%. Simon studied the screen and let it all sink in. He ran the locations through his mind, factoring in what he knew about city densities, mountain ranges, forests, lakes, and other natural barriers. I doubt that's enough for complete coverage. Could the EM field inside the clouds be a reflector of some kind? Would that be possible? G asked. I suppose. It would amplify the range and effectiveness of the wave. The burst would be contained below the hovering EM field, causing it to bounce and reflect between the ground and the storm. G's face indicated he agreed. And it would compensate for the curvature of the Earth, allowing it to continue over great distances. Seems to me they wouldn't need as many emitters that way, Wick said, looking at G. Yep. You'd end up with faster installation and less people in the loop. Makes sense. Wicks nodded. Then they're expecting some major event to set the people off across the country. Once we see it, we'll know the burst is about to happen. Hang on, Simon said. If they need the rain to control and intensify the emitters, then the storm would need to continue until your event happens. That might be days or weeks from now. Uprisings don't happen overnight. They take time to fester and build. Maybe the red rain happened too early, she said. Or they need the rain to be around for a while first. Soak into the dirt or something, like a ground conductor. Sorry, kids, I'm still not convinced, Simon said, feeling like a frustrated father trying to get through to his children. Why? Wicks asked. When you're older, you'll come to realize that just about everyone on this planet is motivated by one of four things: money, sex, power, or revenge. I don't see how covering the planet in red rain and then setting off a widespread microwave burst would accomplish any of that. Everyone would be affected, including the person or persons behind this. G looked around the room, his mind clearly in thinking mode. Simon? Yeah? I'm pretty sure my equipment won't like being blasted with microwaves. Simon nodded. No, it won't. Neither will anyone else's computers or electronics. Nothing would be safe. Which is why I don't think the blast will happen for the reasons you think, if at all. Don't forget, if satellite surveillance is down and so are the broadcast signals, then how would the people behind this know when to set off the burst? I see your point, G said. Simon nodded. To maximize its effectiveness, they'd wait until widespread anarchy happened first. Surveillance would be key for the timing to be correct. But if the burst does happen, wouldn't it send us back to the Stone Age? Computers and other electronics would be toast, right? Simon didn't want to debate the kids anymore. Let them run through it, he decided. Then they'd see he was right. He shrugged. Yes, they'd be useless. Wick's face indicated she agreed. It would explain why all those scientists have gone missing. If you take out the greatest minds, it leaves fewer resources to fight back against what's coming. Or fight back after what's coming, G said, looking at Simon. It's the tactical thing to do, right, Red? Tactically speaking, yes. First, you target your enemy's ability to communicate and react. Then you disrupt their transportation systems. If the enemy's forces can't communicate or resupply, leadership is rendered ineffective, and the war is over before it begins. War? Wicks asked. You know what I mean. Let's not forget the busload of scientists that were gunned down in Washington, G said with a nervous voice. Simon shook his head, realizing they weren't going to let this go. Not after bringing up the horrible crimes his wife had committed. He sighed before he spoke. His voice became elevated. Yes, a quick and effective strike, like Wyatt said about my wife's actions during his roadblock. Plus, with Tessa's lengthy trial and her execution broadcast live around the world, everyone's attention was focused on one thing. It might have given the perpetrators the window of opportunity they needed to launch their plan without anyone noticing. Except us, G said with a smile. The facts do seem to line up, don't they? Wicks asked Simon. She was starting to sound more like him every minute, Simon decided. Certainly more mature than her 24 or so years on the planet. Sure, to some extent, yes. They seem to fit, but not perfectly. We're clearly missing something. It's called motive. Without knowing the endgame and its purpose, it's all a guessing game at this point. Sure, I get that, but hear us out. That's why me and G saved your butt in the alley, to help us think through this type of stuff. You agreed to help us, right? Wasn't that the deal? He didn't remember formally agreeing to help them, but he did owe them his life. Sure, go ahead. I'm all ears. If there's a master plan at work here, and all these things are happening for a reason, then you have to ask yourself, why did they make your wife do what she did, and not someone else? Nothing seems to be random here, so that would mean she was chosen. The answer came unbidden into his thoughts, causing him to pause for a few seconds to process. Wicks was correct. Based on your line of thinking, then it seems reasonable to assume that someone wanted me out of the way. And not just you, right? She asked in a leading manner. He understood where she was going with this. Yes, and my company too. After the massacre, I was so wrapped up in what was happening with Tessa, I couldn't devote much time to running the day-to-days as CEO. The press was everywhere and wouldn't leave me or my company alone for a second. That's why the board of directors had no choice but to fire me. She shook her head. Canning you was a bad move on their part, Red. Ghostworks never would have gone out of business with you at the helm, even with the press all over you like that. Simon agreed, but it didn't change the facts. Cut off the head of the snake, and the rest dies. But Ghostworks isn't the only private security firm, is it? Wicks asked him. No. At the time, there were two major players, my company and Nighthawk Services Group, Blake Anderchuk's company, a high-speed, low-drag kind of guy. A decorated fighter pilot turned billionaire playboy, a real piece of work. He and I have two completely different philosophies about what's acceptable and what's not. Then we have to assume they wanted Nighthawk handling everything instead of your company. Maybe so, but it still doesn't tell us who's behind this, unless, of course, it's Anderchuk himself, but I find that hard to believe. The scope of what we're talking about would take a group of power brokers and rich elitists to pull it all off. No, there's still more we don't know, I'm afraid.
Don't forget your parents and grandparents. They were scientists too,
G told Wicks with a sharp tone. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. You know, I never really wanted to believe it, but it must be true. Someone wanted them out of the way just like Simon and his company, and those scientists in the bus, all of it to make way for what's happening right now. Simon waited while Wicks calmed a bit. He spoke once her breathing had slowed. You mentioned something earlier about exotic chemicals being shipped? Her eyes sharpened, stopping the tears. G's Digger program noticed a government research lab in Bogota, Colombia was shipping hundreds of containers to an over-the-counter supplement company called Blue Water Kinetics in Key West, Florida. Turns out, the containers were full of a hyper-extract from a tree indigenous to South America. It's called the borrachero. In pure concentrate form, it can be used to make a drug called the devil's breath. Have you heard of it?
G answered her before Simon could. Some of the underground websites say it can block free will, erase memory, and even kill.
Oh yeah, I've heard of it. We called it scopolamine on the farm. Every new recruit spends weeks learning to resist its effects. I'm thinking that's why they targeted Tessa and not you, Wick said. Could be. I am trained to resist various forms of truth agents.
Yep,
G said.
Go after the woman, not the man. We all know that females are the weaker sex.
Wick sneered at him. You know it was more than that, right? G shrugged. Simon didn't agree with G, but chose not to reprimand the kid. Now, if someone had altered the chemistry of scopolamine and then introduced a variant of it into my wife's bloodstream to control her, then your wife wasn't at fault for what she did, Wick said in a matter-of-fact tone, looking at him like she was waiting for something to happen. Shit. The kids were onto something. Could they be right? The facts seemed to indicate they were. Simon's heart sank into his chest, sending a storm of shame into his bones. He couldn't believe what he'd just learned. The ramifications were too intense, sending his supply of self-loathing skyrocketing to an all-time high. He should have believed Tessa when she said she wasn't at fault for the killings. Someone made her do it. If this was all true, it meant she was merely a pawn in a global chess match, a game rigged to take him and his company down, and then cause chaos across the planet. Simon suddenly felt weak and powerless as a sickening wave of guilt flooded every cell in his body. Then, a mountain of regret jumped on for good measure, causing his logic to shut down and his breathing to become labored. He thought he was about to pass out, when all of a sudden Wicks wrapped her arms around him from the side, squeezing tight. "I'm sorry, Simon. I know it hurts, but we had to tell you. You needed to know." Chapter 6. 10 minutes later, Simon found the strength to shake off the inner turmoil and bring himself back to reality. A moment later, Wicks let go of her arms, freeing him from the comfort of her grip.
The question is, how did they get devil's breath into her system? G asked.
"Did she start taking any new medicines? Before it happened?" Wicks asked Simon.
Not that I remember. She was a bit of a fitness freak and hated prescription drugs. In fact, she went out of her way to avoid them. Tessa preferred holistic medicine and all those natural remedies you see on the health and fitness shows. She didn't even drink coffee, or alcohol for that matter. Seems like every time I turned around, she was slamming another can of that new sports drink. The one with the matrix of numbers on its label. Can't remember its name, though. Brain flurry, G reported with assuredness in his words. It's on just about every commercial break. At least it used to be before the red rain came along and put an end to all the broadcasts. Yes, brain flurry, with the green eco label. I remember she tried a sample after it came in the mail one day and was hooked. I swear she went through a case of that crap a week. That must have been the entry point. Shit, that's too easy.
Brilliant, if you ask me. Just think about it. We get these free samples in the mail and we assume they're legit because they have packaging we recognize. Truth is, they could be from anyone and contain poison for all we know, Wicks said.
But what about the psychic conditioning? G asked. The drink might have made her pliable, but who conditioned her subconscious to gun down all those people?
Good question. She never would have done that willingly, Simon answered, running through it in his mind. She did drink that stuff before every workout, and then listened to music as she exercised. It's possible whoever is behind this tainted her music with some type of subliminal messaging.
Submasking is what we call it in the tech world, G said. That type of indirect stimuli is pretty easy to do with the right voodoo. That's how I would have done it.
Simon nodded. Now that we know how it happened, we should focus on what to do next, Wicks said, rubbing his shoulder with a gentle hand. Simon knew she was right. If a burst is coming, then we need to get prepared. We don't know how much time we have, so we'd better rally all hands on deck. I agree, Wicks said. Simon checked the walls of the room. I take it your grandparents didn't take steps to shield this room. Wicks shook her head.
Why would they? G asked. They didn't believe in modern electronics, let alone solar arrays and server farms. All that came after they, passed.
Did I screw up, Simon? By bringing in all this technology? Wicks asked him, her face covered in doubt. He rubbed her shoulder, wanting to return the favor of comfort. No, you're just not finished yet. Don't beat yourself up. Nobody could have predicted what's happening outside. Nobody. His comments seemed to comfort her.
What do you have in mind? G asked in an agitated voice. We've already brought in everything that's not nailed down, like you asked.
Well, for starters, shielding this room to protect all the data you've gathered. Once the burst hits, the internet and all the systems connected to it will probably be useless. All we'll have left at that point is the equipment and data stored here, he said, taking another half-minute to think. Then, we'll need to figure out how to protect your solar array so it can keep the batteries charged. If we're right, the grid will fail too, and last but not least, we need to shield the generator out back. Shielding and fuel will be a priority. There's a lot to do, so we'd better get started.
For shielding, I'm assuming you mean build Faraday cages? The tech whiz asked.
Yup, but we're going to need a significant amount of conductive material to make that happen, he said, turning to Wicks. You don't happen to have a shed full of copper wire somewhere, do you? No, Simon. No copper, she answered, letting her eyes drop to the ground. A few seconds later, her eyes returned to his. But we do have a huge stack of old window screens around back. I replaced them all a few years ago. Would they work?
For some of it, yes. But protecting everything isn't going to be easy. We'll have to pick and choose, then build shielding as needed out of whatever we can scrounge.
Hey, wait a minute, G said, scratching his head. There's an old phone company central office about 2 miles from here. You know, from back before landlines fell under the control of the NSA and basically went the way of the dinosaur. There's got to be a ton of copper in there, right?
Possibly, assuming it hasn't been looted by now, Simon answered. But it's worth a look.
If not, there are still thousands of miles of phone cable hanging from poles across Lancaster County. If I remember right, it should be 22-gauge wire in 100-pair bundles. Probably only need to grab a section or two between poles. Then we'll have to melt the casing off.
I like that idea better. Once we have the material, I can walk you through how to use it for what we need.
No offense, Red, but I think I can handle it, G said, flashing more finger commands into his system. The display in front of him changed, showing the schematic for a coffin-sized Faraday cage made out of hardware cloth, copper wire, and metal-infused duct tape. He pointed at the drawing. Is this what you had in mind?
That's it, exactly, except larger.
Piece of cake. All I'll need is a shitload of wire, and I can build the rest.
Simon turned his attention to Wicks. Sounds like a job for the men of Pandora. They'll need a chainsaw and a trailer. You do have those around here, right?
Oh yeah, and then some, she said with vigor. Don't forget the boneyard. There's a ton of old junk in there. Lots of metal, too, G told her. I'll go let Slayer and Diesel know. Anything else on your shopping list?
I think it's time to look over your weapons cache.
Weapons cache? Is he serious? G asked Wicks.
Wicks held her tongue and didn't respond, giving the teen wonder an intense stare. She looked at Simon. Simon wasn't sure what was going on with the two kids, so he ignored their interplay. If what we think is going to happen happens, we need to address tactical, and soon.
All things tactical and practical, Wicks said, showing a sly grin. I should probably tell you, Kat has a copy of your book, and she wants you to sign it, but she's way too shy to ask.
I'll take care of it, Simon said, giving her a wink. His failed book must have been what Kat was hiding under her arms when she was sitting at the table in the kitchen earlier. You know, all she had to do was ask and I would have signed it for her.
He obviously doesn't know Kat,
G said with a smirk on his face, leaning in close to his monitor, twipping his fingers to show the next page of Faraday cage instructions. Simon turned to Wicks. It took a few seconds for the words to line up properly on his lips. You might also want to call your brother on the radio. Let him know he was right about the rain. Something major is about to happen, and he should prepare. ASAP. She nodded, but didn't look too happy about it. Not that he could blame her. Admitting you were wrong to a family member wasn't easy for anyone, and Wicks appeared to be no exception. President Cooper took the last swig of brain flurry and tossed the empty can into the trash can before stepping into the east elevator of the White House. He moved to the rear of the car and waited for his 3-man Secret Service detail to follow in behind him. They did, turning around to face the front with their customary comm units stuck in their ears. One of them pushed the number 4 button on the control panel. The device lit up and chimed just before the world's slowest elevator crawled into motion. Cooper's body rocked from left to right, matching the shimmy of the lift. A moment later, the overhead music started playing a new tune, one he hadn't heard before. It was light and airy, sounding like a Christmas melody, which was odd since the calendar was a long way from the busy holiday season. He welcomed the chance to enjoy the upbeat tune as it entered his ears and found its way to his heart. All it took was that single moment of tranquility to whisk away the mounting stress that had been brought on by millions of concerned voters demanding answers. The rain was still falling, and so, too, was the nation's economy, neither of which his administration was prepared to deal with. Not today, and not now. His eyes focused on the smallest of the men around him, the new guy, Cliff Giovanni from Carlsbad, California. Then his lips started moving on their own, deciding to strike up a chat with the wide-eyed agent. So tell me, Cliff, how's that lovely wife of yours doing? She's still hoping to make the Olympic team next year? Yes, Mr. President.
the handsome young Italian said, turning to Cooper to make eye contact.
Christina's doubled her cross-country workouts, trying to earn the last spot. She knows it's a long shot, but she's hopeful.
Cooper could see Giovanni's sidearm hanging from a shoulder rig inside his suit coat.
I wish her luck. That level of training can't be easy on a relationship, especially with your extended duty shifts around here. It's a wonder you two haven't started wearing name tags at home just in case you happen to bump into each other every now and then.
Giovanni smiled, then let it go.
It's definitely a challenge, sir, but we're making it work. Right now, our careers are front and center. I support her dreams 100%, and she mine. It's important to have goals, especially when you're first starting out. Oh, how I remember the early days. My first campaign was for city councilman in Boulder. It was a complete clusterfuck, but my wife had my back and convinced me to try again the next time around. We did, and we won. So I'm a firm believer in doing whatever you need to do to succeed. Speaking of which, Christina might want to try that new sports drink, Brain Flurry. It's done wonders for my workouts every morning. I'm up to 6 miles a day and feeling like a new man. Yes, sir. I'll be sure to mention it to her. Thank you, sir. Just tell her to look for the green label with all the numbers on it. Can't miss it, he said, feeling damn good about himself.
He didn't know why, but just then, before his next breath, his hand shot out and grabbed the man's Colt 1911 from its holster. All in one motion, Cooper released the safety, cocked the .45 caliber weapon, and held it up at Giovanni's face before anyone else could react. He pulled the trigger without the slightest hesitation or remorse, sending a round at the man's left eye. The bullet tore into the man's skull, spraying the area with blood and brain matter. Cooper turned the weapon on the other 2 agents and fired 2 more shots before they could whirl around and defend themselves. Each bullet found its mark, sending the men to the floor in a bloody heap. He could feel the run of tissue clinging to his cheeks and nose, so he wiped the residue off with his tie. Then he bent down and found a second gun before stuffing his pockets with a host of magazines he found on the agents. He chambered the second gun ready as well, then waited for the elevator doors to open. When they did, he stepped out with both pistols in a firing position, making his way across the carpeted, well-appointed hall to the 4th floor conference room, where some of his staff and several members of Congress were waiting. A second later, he charged through the doorway and opened fire with both guns. Chapter 7. Ray Austin was well on his way to Pandora to pass along Wyatt's important message to Tally when he hit the brakes and jerked the steering wheel of Wyatt's truck to the left, hoping to avoid a fallen tree coming up fast on the right. He did, just missing the deadfall. It had been obscured by the wet grass covering the path that cut through the backwoods of Pennsylvania. His foot let go of the brake pedal and stomped on the gas, wanting to keep his speed up as his hands worked the wheel back to the right. However, his adjustment was too strong, causing him to overcompensate and send the vehicle into a full spin.
Oh, shit,
he said as the truck did 2 full revolutions, sliding across the slippery surface and bringing dizziness to his eyes. He fought for control of the Chevy and finally won, correcting the spin a few seconds later. He exhaled in relief, seeing that the truck was moving forward and still on the same country trail as before. Austin figured he was only a handful of miles from Pandora and making damn good time. Wyatt would be pleased. But before his next heartbeat could finish its thump, the path curved to the right. He took the truck around the corner, where the wilderness brought a new surprise to his eyes, a steep downhill grade. Wait, check that. A steep cliff.
Fuck!
He screamed when the front tires found the downslope. The ground disappeared, and the vehicle went airborne, sending his head and shoulders crashing into the top of the truck. His feet came off the floorboard, then slammed down a few seconds later when gravity brought the terrain back under the tires. A loud clank rang out from the truck's undercarriage as his chest smashed into the top of the steering wheel, knocking the wind out of him. He gasped for breath, just as the front wheels hit something and spun hard to the left, locking into position. The vehicle's inertia kept it barreling straight down the hill, plowing through the thick brush with the front bumper and grille. Twigs, leaves, and branches bounced off the windshield in rapid fashion as the journey continued down the fading hillside. Just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, the front wheels caught traction on something while they were still cocked to the right, veering the truck hard to the side. The Chevy began to roll, sending him bouncing around the inside like a rag doll. His back hit the roof, then the seat, then the roof again. Over and over he went, with glass breaking and metal crunching around him. Austin felt like a dryer sheet being tossed around on laundry day. He figured it was only a matter of seconds before he'd break his neck or smash his head on something. However, before his lungs could draw another breath, he heard a loud swoosh. Then the truck's movement slowed and eventually stopped altogether. Austin exhaled and blinked, letting his mind catch up to his swirling vision. He found himself sitting upright in the front passenger seat with his hands on the dashboard and his feet planted on the floorboard. He quickly felt around his body, expecting to find blood or a broken bone or two sticking out, but everything felt normal. He was dazed and sore, but okay. He didn't know how it happened, but it did. He'd survived a violent tumble off a cliff. In front of him was the hood of the truck. It had been bent up like an accordion, but the windshield was still intact, including the windshield wipers, which were still running. His eyes and his mind couldn't believe it. The truck started swaying, making him think it was drifting to the left. Austin looked to his right and saw something rising up the side of the truck. Water. In an instant, he realized what had happened. The Chevy had miraculously landed on its wheels in a flowing river at the bottom of the hill. The water must have cradled the vehicle like a baby in its mother's arms, giving it a soft landing. It was all a little hard to believe, but the facts were undeniable. Somehow, he'd survived with barely a scratch. The rising water caught his attention and panic took over, making him go for the door handle out of instinct, but it wasn't there.
Freaking old trucks!
Then his logic returned, and he realized the passenger side window had been blown out during the freefall. He pried himself up and crawled out of the sinking truck and began to swim. The water was cold and moving briskly, but his arms and legs managed to paddle him to the shore safely. Tallywicky took a deep breath in her grandfather's home office before grabbing the base station's microphone to call her brother. Wyatt had been right all along about the red rain and its imminent threat, but she didn't want to admit it to her brother. In the grand scheme of things, she normally didn't have a problem admitting when she was wrong. However, when Wyatt was the person she needed to confess her failure to, it was a big deal. More so than she cared to admit. She didn't know why he always seemed to put her on the defensive, but he did. Probably a brother thing, she told herself, remembering one of their rousing games of capture the flag. She usually won, and it pissed off Wyatt to no end. Once in a while, though, she'd throw the match, letting him win so he wouldn't be an asshole the rest of the day. "You have to let the peasants enjoy a victory now and then," she mumbled, giving her a moment of bliss. She smiled. "Otherwise, they quit and take their ball home." The ham radio was powered on and hissing quietly, waiting for her to act. She decided it was time and depressed the microphone's transmit handle. WX6FR, 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 this is ZS5BD, calling Zulu X-Ray 6 Foxtrot Romeo and standing by. The frequency cracked and hissed, but no one answered, even after a full minute had ticked by. "He always answers, eventually," she muttered, thinking it through. She couldn't remember a single time that a member of Jericho failed to answer her hail. Wyatt always left the radio on and kept it tuned to their designated channel, Green Mountain S1. She tried again and again, but like before, only static was heard. She decided to listen and wait for a good minute, but there was still only static. Wyatt wasn't the only one not transmitting. Nobody else was either. It was odd that others weren't chatting away on the popular channel too. It made her wonder if her radio was working correctly. If not, then Wyatt wasn't receiving her transmission, or anyone else's. She continued her hails for another 10 minutes before finally giving up and walking away. She made a mental note to have Diesel tear into the ham equipment to see if something needed to be fixed. Chapter 8. Director Nancy Wiggins put her head back against the headrest of the SUV, hauling her to the White House for her scheduled briefing with President Cooper. The motorcade was making good time, even though it was sloshing through the endless rain. She closed her eyes, hoping to let the mounting stress from the weather insanity melt from her body. She was exhausted, and her back was killing her. 2 problems she wrestled with daily. The steady rain was falling like a perpetual red menace, causing havoc for everyone across the planet. Her recovery team had come up empty at Hansen's Deepwater Research Facility, and she was running out of ideas for where to look for him. She wasn't sure what to tell the president, and now only had 13 minutes to think of something before their meeting. Of course, she couldn't inform her boss about everything that had happened, since some of it was done off-book and never authorized. Vito Indigo's intel may have been accurate when he secretly passed it along to her, but by the time her men had reached the underwater location, there was no sign of Hansen. Everyone else had vacated the facility, except Tim O'Neill, one of the techs. His body was found inside a damaged section with a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Her team's commander reported significant damage to one of the biodomes, but little else to explain what had happened. Her men had searched every square inch of the station, but found no clues as to the fugitive's whereabouts or evidence to suggest who killed the tech. The shooter may have been Hansen, but without witnesses and forensic evidence to support a theory, the only thing she could be sure of was Hansen wasn't there. She figured he bugged out after launching his global weather event, disappearing to some foreign land where the red blanket of chaos would allow him to slip into the masses and cover his tracks. "Back to square one," she said, using her quiet voice. The same voice that kept her company at night in her luxury 1-bedroom condo on Virginia Avenue when its cream-colored walls and her faithful stuffed poodle, Winnie, were the only ones listening to her. She couldn't remember the last time she ran a mop across the condo's hardwood floors or scrubbed its aging toilets, both of which were long overdue for a good cleaning. She was certain there were layers of bacteria and related gunk growing in places she hadn't even checked yet, probably toxic enough to gag a billy goat. Her closet was a federal disaster area, and she was in dire need of a makeover, but none of her domestic problems were going to be addressed anytime soon. "Gotta suck it up and press on," her lips told her, knowing she had a job to do. She took her directorship seriously and swore to complete her job to the best of her abilities. This would be her life until Hansen was found and the red rain faded into history. Her cell phone buzzed, taking her attention away from her own private pity party. What now? She wondered, checking the device. The caller ID said Bandbox, the code name for the Secret Service division at the White House. "Director Wiggins," she answered, feeling her heart pound a little faster. "Director, we have a situation." "Explain," she said, recognizing the monotone, grizzled voice. It was Supervising Agent Bill Myers, a dedicated 20-year veteran who spoke with a distinctive Michigan accent. Myers rarely called her directly, unless there was a pressing security matter, and only if Myers couldn't get a hold of his boss, Director Chance. Wiggins prepared herself. "There's been a series of shootings, and, well, ma'am, Silverlight is down," Myers said. She knew the code name Silverlight. It was the last name she wanted to hear as the victim of a shooting. She needed confirmation. "I'm sorry. I don't think I heard you correctly. What did you say?" "Silverlight has been shot." She suddenly found it hard to breathe. Her lips ran dry, and so did her mouth. "POTUS? How? Where?" "It happened at 2600. They're rushing him to Walter Reed, but it doesn't look good. His vitals were unresponsive, Director." Her jaw dropped. It had been decades since anyone had gotten close enough to the president to shoot him, and now it had happened on her watch and in the White House, the worst possible scenario for the Director of National Intelligence. She paused long enough to compose herself. It worked, allowing her to find that special headspace where logic trumps emotion. "Anyone else hurt?" "Yes, ma'am. 13 killed, including Amanda Murray, his chief of staff, plus 11 wounded.
Jesus Christ, Bill! How the hell did this happen?
So much for her logic trumping emotion. Her brain went into battle again with her anxiety. Myers cleared his throat, then let out a few inaudible grunts before he answered. His voice was now uneven and shaky. Well, we're not entirely sure. Stevens and Franklin are still gathering information from witnesses, but right now it looks like a lone gunman overpowered 3 members of Horsepower and acquired their weapons and ammo, then went on a killing spree. Horsepower was the code name for the Presidential Protective Unit. If someone had overpowered the finest agents of the Secret Service, then it seemed likely they were dealing with a trained assassin, someone with the skills to infiltrate and overcome highly skilled operators.
Is 2600 secure? Is the shooter still on property? She asked.
Yes and no. Agent Cartwright brought the gunman down just outside the bookstore. It was obvious code names were part of Myers' DNA. It was going to be difficult to tear him away from it, especially in an emotionally charged crisis like this, but she didn't have the time or the energy for radio procedure.
No code names, Myers. Just give me the details straight up.
Yes, Director. My apologies. The incident ended just outside the White House Communications Center after 3 staff members were fatally wounded.
I still can't believe what I'm hearing. How did a gunman roam around 2600 and get off so many rounds? Where the hell was everyone?
There was a long silence. Wiggins wasn't sure if the line disconnected.
Myers, you still with me?
Yes I am. But, well, that's the thing. We were there, but the gunman was... Crap, this is insane. How do I put this? The shooter was POTUS, ma'am. Her brain froze, trying to process the last few words Myers had said. The man continued his explanation. My men weren't sure what was going on when they found POTUS covered in blood splatter and holding 2 firearms. We've trained for every conceivable scenario, except this one, Director. Nobody was prepared for the President of the United States being the shooter.
No, I imagine not.
It cost some of my men their lives by not assessing the situation correctly when they met up with him. How in the hell do you fire upon the Commander-in-Chief, the same man you've sworn to give up your life to protect? I don't know how he did it, but Cartwright finally realized what was happening and engaged, but it took 3 rounds to put down the, shooter. Cartwright's completely beside himself, ma'am, trying to deal with what just happened. Wiggins paused to breathe and compose herself, pushing her emotions aside, then continued.
I assume you're in lockdown?
Yes, Director. Emergency protocols have been initiated.
Until we know more, I want a tight lid put on this. No calls in or out, and for heaven's sake, no press. When I arrive, I'll want a complete sit rep.
Consider it done. I've already frozen the switchboard, except for this one line.
Is Director Chance on his way?
No, I haven't called my boss yet. I decided to contact you first since I knew you had a meeting with POTUS and were probably close by. I didn't want you to arrive uninformed.
I appreciate that, Myers. But now I need you to follow the chain of command and contact your boss. He needs to be read in. Let him know we spoke and that I'll be on scene in 5.
Chapter 9. Zeke Olson continued scanning internet feeds for news about his boss, Vito Indigo. Zeke hadn't heard a peep from Indigo since their communication link failed while Vito's plane was flying over the Atlantic, spying on an expensive yacht. So far, he hadn't found any mention of a private jet plane crash on the news, giving him a glimmer of hope that what he thought happened didn't. The butler bot Mark II cruised into the room, carrying a snack tray with cheese and crackers. Zeke remembered seeing the items under plastic wrap on the bottom shelf of the fridge. The robot stood next to him, its servos and motors humming along. He took the tray from the device and put it on the desk in front of him. The bot spun around and went back into the kitchen, taking a direct line like a dog to a bone. Zeke should have been hungry, but wasn't, even though it had been hours since he'd last eaten. His sole focus was on Vito, his mentor and friend. Feeding his belly was the last thing on his mind. The cover doors to the main room swooshed open, indicating someone was about to enter. He spun in the swivel chair and stood up, moving to greet them with a racing heart. Was it Indigo? Or someone with news about his boss? Either would be good, because not knowing was eating him up inside. The butler bot joined him, racing at 3 times its normal speed. It, too, may have been excited in its own way. 2 men dressed in designer black suits and red ties came through the door. Each wore dark sunglasses and carried a briefcase in their left hand.
Mr. Olson, I presume?
The shorter of the 2 men asked.
Yes, I'm Zeke,
he answered, feeling a wave of gloom suddenly wash over his spine. Something was wrong. He could feel it. His stomach started doing flip-flops as the unexpected encounter ticked forward.
May we come inside? We have urgent business to discuss.
Zeke swallowed the lump of saliva flooding his mouth, then nodded. He moved aside to let the men enter. They moved past him and headed directly into the kitchen, almost as if they'd been there before. He noticed each was carrying a sidearm hanging inside their suit coats, both in shoulder holsters. At first, he thought they were lawyers, but now he was starting to think they were private security, given the weapons. They certainly didn't dress, look, act, or walk like a couple of attorneys. Their posture was full and erect, and their steps measured and precise. They reminded him of soldiers on a march. Under normal circumstances, he never would have welcomed a couple of armed strangers into his home. But since this wasn't his home, and only a few inside Indigo's circle of trust knew about the safe house and how to enter it, he wasn't worried. They were supposed to be here, same as he was. But the real question looming on his mind was, why were they here? Zeke and the butler bot stood next to the table in the kitchen and watched the men slide their briefcases into place and open them. The latches on both cases snapped in unison, as if the men had rehearsed the procedure. Their hands went inside, and each man pulled out a thick stack of paper and a pen. There was a binder clip in the corner holding the paperwork together, and Zeke could see at least 10 red tabs sticking out along the margins.
What's that?
Zeke asked, pointing. His gut already knew the answer, but his brain wanted confirmation. Assignment papers, the man answered, his voice soft and borderline feminine, not what Zeke expected.
For what?
I was under the impression you were already informed of this potentiality and had agreed to accept it.
Potentiality?
Vito Indigo's last will and testament. Now that he's gone, you're the executor and sole beneficiary of all of his assets, including controlling interest in Indigo Technologies. Zeke felt dizzy and weak in the knees. His hand grabbed the top of the kitchen chair and spun it around just in time for his rear end to land in it. All the energy drained from his body as reality came crashing down. Take a minute, Mr. Olson. When you're ready, we have a number of contracts and other documents for you to sign. Once they're executed, we'll take you to the firm's lead attorney, Mr. Stanton, who will walk you through what comes next. Zeke wanted to acknowledge their instructions, but his lips wouldn't move. His eyes glazed over as he leaned forward in the chair and tried to focus on his shoes. As the seconds passed, he found it increasingly difficult to breathe because of the sharp pain growing in his chest. He'd just learned that the one man he loved and respected more than anyone else was gone. But grief wasn't the only emotion consuming him. There was also a bubbling sense of elation and excitement, because in a matter of minutes, he was about to become the richest, most powerful businessman on the planet. He had 2 edges of the same sword tearing into him, sending 1,000,000 thoughts and images racing through his mind all at once, making it difficult to process. A second later, everything went black, and he hit the floor. Chapter 10. A black hood was removed from Jeffrey Hansen's head, filling his dilated pupils with artificial light from the overhead bank of fluorescent lights. He adjusted his posture while seated in a chair, then squinted while he waited for his eyes to adjust to the brightness. The long boat ride and subsequent jungle walk had given him plenty of time to think about his next move. It was a miracle he'd survived thus far, But what was about to come next would take every ounce of skill and resolve he could muster. He peered to the right and saw fellow prisoner Crosby for the first time. His friend was sitting in a wooden chair with his hands tied behind his back. Crosby's eyes met his.
"Hey, buddy. You look like shit,"
Hansen said, wearing a smile to take the edge off the stressful situation. He, too, was bound to the chair with his hands behind his back.
"Silence!"
a man snapped with a thick Cuban accent, smacking Hansen on the back of the head. The slap stung, but the pain quickly faded. Hansen studied Crosby's face, taking in every curve and shadow, wanting to remember what the man looked like. If things didn't go well in the next few minutes, he might never see Crosby's face again. Usually, when you meet someone face to face after only talking with them remotely, their appearance rarely matches the portrait you've drawn in your head. Not so with Crosby. He looked just like the tenured college professor Hansen had envisioned. An older, bearded gentleman with shoulder-length curly gray hair, a slender nose that came to a point, high cheekbones, and a tired, wrinkled face. His legs were much longer than Hansen's, and his torso slender. Too slender for Crosby's estimated height. Of course, having been a captive of the drug lord Carlos Santiago for more days than Crosby could probably count, his new friend looked about as good as could be expected under the circumstances. He wondered if Crosby would say the same about him right now. Hansen's body was sore and covered in bruises, but what worried him the most were the gunshot wounds. They were now oozing a pink-colored goo through the witch doctor's stitches, indicating a nasty infection might be underway. It was imperative he work out a deal with the drug kingpin before sepsis ended his life. It had taken several requests and 2 rounds of interrogations before the low-level drug runners finally relayed his message to Santiago. Hansen thought the cartel boss would have come to the island where he was being held prisoner, but that assumption turned out to be wrong. He and Crosby had spent the last hour or so in a speedboat, flying across the Atlantic on their way to here, wherever here was. Hansen checked the room and counted 3 armed men, each with tattered clothes, weathered tans, and dirty fingernails. He knew he'd only get 1 shot at this. If he failed to convince Santiago to accept his proposition, they'd learn firsthand how Santiago had earned the nickname Jigsaw. Negotiating with a brutal leader, one with the skill and motivation to kill anyone at any time, was certainly a gamble. Some might cower in the corner and not want to try, but that wasn't how Hansen was wired. As CEO of Raintech, he'd spent a fair share of his adult life sitting across the table from ruthless leaders, those with the skill and motivation to take out anyone at any time. Of course, those leaders were typically members of Congress, the CIA, or the military, sometimes all 3. But regardless, the rules of negotiation were the same. Win at all costs, or die trying. The door to the mostly empty room flew open in front of him, and in walked 3 men. The man leading the way was smoking a full-length cigar and wearing a pale green military uniform with no insignia or other markings. However, the tilted black beret on his head featured a curved gold knife embroidered on the front. Hansen didn't recognize the symbol, but it may have been the man's brand. Hansen assumed the beret-wearing, long-haired man in the middle was Jigsaw, not the other 2 who were walking a step behind. The other men were 6 inches taller and carried assault rifles, plus their tactical vests were stuffed with mags and frags. Obviously, they were the security team. Hansen studied their weapons, SCAR AR-10s, military grade with muzzle brakes, tactical scopes, and all the trimmings. The smoking man gave a head nod to the 3 Cubans who'd escorted Hansen and Crosby to the meeting from the speedboat earlier. The men didn't hesitate, moving quickly through the door and disappearing outside. The smoking man closed the door, then took off his sunglasses and sat in the empty chair across from Hansen. He leaned forward, aiming his hawk-like black eyes at Hansen while exhaling a cloud of second-hand smoke. Hansen tried to hold back a cough when the smoke entered his lungs, but couldn't. Out it came, making his upper body convulse with each expulsion of air. The smoking man laughed, looking at his two guards. They joined him with a chuckle of their own, though their rendition sounded forced, probably to show unwavering support for their leader. Laugh or feel the end of my blade was the vibe Hansen was sensing in the dreary, paint-peeling room. Jigsaw looked to be in his 30s, with shoulder-length, wavy black hair hanging wildly from the brim of the beret. His rugged, handsome looks and neatly trimmed facial hair made him look more like a wannabe peace-loving activist from the 60s, a college dropout who was rallying the pot-smoking crowd to rise up and protest the actions of the government. If he had to pick one celebrity for a look-alike contest, he would have chosen a young Josh Brolin, but Hansen knew his perception of Jigsaw was wrong, dead wrong, and he needed to act accordingly. "You have precisely 2 minutes. I'd suggest you make every second count," Jigsaw said, his friendly expression suddenly turning sharp and focused. Hansen was surprised by the man's perfect English, not a hint of a Cuban accent. His voice sounded American, born and raised, possibly well-educated, somewhere in the Midwest, if he had to guess.
My name's Hansen. My friend over there is Crosby, a linguistics professor at the University of Miami.
Jigsaw didn't respond, but his eyes did scan Hansen and then Crosby. The tension in the room seemed to tighten more, if that was even possible.
I have a proposition for you,
Hansen said in his most confident voice. "I'm listening."
If you set us free, I'll wire $5 million to any account you'd like.
Jigsaw stood up in a flash, turned and went for the door. "Kill 'em both. Dump their bodies in the shark tank." His men aimed their rifles.
"Wait!"
Hansen yelled, realizing he'd made a mistake. Jigsaw stopped, holding a closed fist up, but never turning to make eye contact. His men lowered their weapons.
20 million, 10 for each of us,
Hansen said, keeping his eyes on Jigsaw's back. Jigsaw brought his eyes around. Then his body followed before returning to his chair. He sat down. "What were you doing on my island when my team found you?" Jigsaw asked, his voice sounding more determined than before. Hansen decided to go with the truth. Well, mostly the truth.
My boat sank, and I was forced to swim to the nearest island. I had no idea it was yours.
Jigsaw hesitated, then moved his eyes to Crosby. "How do you know this man?" he asked, pointing his cigar in the direction of Hansen.
Crosby broke his silence. Your men tossed him in the cell next to mine.
So you two are friends, then?
More like acquaintances. Until that moment, I'd never met the man before. He's telling you God's honest truth, Hansen added.
Interesting, Jigsaw said, taking another 2 puffs of the cigar. He let out the smoke, puffing rings into the air like a gangster in an old black and white B-movie. He looked at Hansen. I have to say, I find it odd you'd offer up $10 million for a man you claim to barely know, and, by extension, care nothing about. Why would anyone choose to do that?
Because I'm a man of my word. Crosby helped me with the Spanish translations so I could communicate with your men. In exchange for his help, I agreed to negotiate for his release. He wants his freedom as badly as I do.
A man of your word, you say?
Yes, sir, and I put my money where my mouth is.
Jigsaw looked at Crosby. And you believe him?
Crosby nodded. I really don't have a choice.
Hansen wanted to drive his point home while he had the tyrant's attention, so he tightened his delivery and added a layer of conviction to his words.
Look, I never bullshit about money or lives. If you let us go, I'll wire you $20 million, US, the very same day we reach American soil.
Jigsaw sneered. Do you know how many people have sat in that very chair and offered me money just so they might have the chance to see one more sunrise?
I'm guessing a few, but trust me, none of them were like me. I have the means.
Well, Mr. Hansen, I'm gonna need proof.
All you need to do is go on the internet and pull up my company's website. I'm the CEO of RainTech, and my face is all over the About Us page. Go ahead, check for yourself. You'll see I'm telling the truth. We're a Fortune 500 company, and I'm the majority stockholder.
Jigsaw grabbed Hansen by the shirt. Look around, asshole. Does it look like we have internet? Hansen held his tongue, feeling there was no right answer. A second later, he was glad he did when Jigsaw continued. You seem like an intelligent guy, Mr. Hansen. If you were in my shoes, tell me, why should I believe anything you have to say?
Well, for starters, I think you already do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have agreed to negotiate with me.
Jigsaw's eyes fired red. Let me be absolutely clear about one thing. This isn't a negotiation. So I'd advise you to choose your words carefully, because they just might be your last. I came here because you told my men you were involved in the red rain that's sweeping the planet. That's the only reason I'm here. Not for money, and certainly not for 20 million. So, right here, right now, I want to know everything you know about the red rain. Otherwise, I'll bleed you slow. And trust me, you'll beg me for a bullet before I'm done. Hansen swallowed hard. Chapter 11. General Rawlings stepped off the Coast Guard Defender boat and onto the rickety wooden dock that had been built alongside the Potomac River decades before. He was relieved to have solid ground under his feet. Well, almost solid ground. He wondered if any of the soggy deck boards would give way as he walked to shore. Regardless, he'd gladly welcomed the monotony of the endless red rain and its dilapidating effects in exchange for the seemingly non-stop turbulence of the Atlantic Ocean. The past few hours on the water were more than enough for one lifetime. Yet, despite his queasy stomach and complete exhaustion, he was thankful to still have a lifetime to enjoy, albeit one filled with the stress of working in Washington. He couldn't say the same for the private jet and its occupants who crashed into the ocean near the Octopus yacht. Their lives ended in a horrific explosion, and the witnesses still weren't sure how it happened. Ahead of him, at the end of the dock, was a trio of men standing together and wearing black raincoats. He didn't recognize any of them. Behind the raincoat brigade was a motorcade of black sedans, with another 11 men spread out across the immediate area, forming a protective circle, each with their back to the vehicles.
Welcome back, General,
the oldest-looking of the three said when Rawlings approached. The bald man's voice was layered with a distinct Texas accent, making Rawlings' ears confirm each word.
Thank you, but now I need you to identify yourself,
Rawlings said, stopping his advance.
My apologies,
the same man said, pulling his credentials out from inside his suit coat. He showed them. The badge identified him as Secret Service Agent Robert Martin.
Service Director Chance sent us here to escort you, General.
Escort me where?
Side R, sir.
Raven Rock. Why?
Night watch protocol's been initiated,
Martin said, opening the side door of the third sedan.
What the hell is going on? General, sir, we have a priority situation, and we need you to please come with us. Director Wiggins is holding on a private channel inside. Please have a seat, sir, and we'll connect you. Then we need to be on our way, ASAP.
Night Watch Protocol meant an imminent threat to the stability and continuity of government existed, causing senior members of government to be evacuated to the Raven Rock facility, a nuclear-hardened underground mountain complex built along the Pennsylvania-Maryland border near Blue Ridge Summit. Normally, senior officials were airlifted to the secure site, but with the red rain grounding all air traffic, he knew he was in for a lengthy ride. The general slid his backside onto the bench seat and climbed in. The door closed behind him, then all 4 door locks locked with a loud click, and the interior lighting darkened a bit. A second later, the floorboard filled with red-colored ambient light. The sedan's security system spoke in a soft female voice, as expected. Counter-surveillance protocols initiated. Interior secure. The display on the back of the seat flickered on, showing the face of director Nancy Wiggins. She looked 1,000 years old. Whatever the situation, it clearly wasn't good. Rawlings twipped his fingers, activating the secure channel from his end.
"What's going on, Nancy?"
Wiggins cleared her throat.
"General, I'm not sure how best to put this, so I'm just going to say it. POTUS is dead."
"What?" Rawlings snapped at her, feeling the permanent knot in his stomach double in size instantly.
"We've had a series of shootings at 2600 and, well, General, President Cooper was victim number 14.
14 people? Are you kidding me? How?"
"Do you remember earlier when we discussed the odd behavior of the president?"
"Yes, clearly."
"I'm afraid we dropped the ball. We should have stepped up and done something then, while we still could."
"What do you mean, Nancy? What does that have to do with this?"
"The shooter was the president. He killed 13 people and wounded 11. Secret Service had to take him down."
"What the hell are you talking about?"
POTUS somehow acquired 2 semi-autos and a stack of reserve ammo, then began shooting. He targeted members of his staff and a few visiting senators. We lost a number of agents as well before Cooper was identified as the threat and neutralized."
"Secret Service killed the president? Is that what I just heard?"
"Yes, Nate. I'm afraid it's all true. We're not sure what's going on or why Cooper did what he did. It could be something about this red rain that we've overlooked or something else entirely. It's possible he just snapped under the pressure. We really don't know. Not yet, anyway. But I have everyone working on it and have instituted a complete media blackout. We've frozen the internet, too, using the shutdown protocols installed by Indigo Technologies. We can't take any chances that word of the shootings or the president's death leaks out. We'll have anarchy."
"I agree. What about cell phones and landlines?"
"Offline, too. Our first priority now is to ensure the continuity of government until we can get this sorted out. To that end, I've initiated the Night Watch protocol, and we're in the process of relocating what's left of the senior staff and top-level congressional members to Site R." Rawlings paused, letting it all soak in.
"So, let me make sure I have this straight. For no apparent reason, President Cooper, a brilliant, stable man I've known for almost 20 years, decides to grab a couple of guns and start killing people? A man respected by his peers and counted on by the American people. Does that sound right to you?"
"No, General. Like I said, something is afoot."
Rawlings shook his head. Then an idea popped into his thoughts. "You know, Nancy, we've seen something like this before."
"When? I don't recall anything like this ever happening."
Tessa Jane, a stable, God-fearing woman I'd also known for decades, suddenly grabbed an assault rifle and went out and killed a busload of scientists and their families.
"You're right, Nate. I hadn't thought of that."
"I can't accept any of this as simply coincidence. Something's not right here. 2 stable, well-respected adults don't just wake up one day and decide to go on a killing spree for no apparent reason."
"If you're right, then none of us is safe. Any one of us could be next. The next shooter or the next victim."
Rawlings continued his verbalized thinking. "Now, if you add in what I just saw over open water, I'm starting to think we might be at war and don't even realize it."
"Explain," she said, her face pinching together with obvious concern.
Shortly after I arrived for the sit-down with Anderchuk on his yacht, a private jet flew over. It was low and fast on the first pass, then it circled around and exploded, again for no apparent reason. Now, keep in mind, the ocean is the one place where aircraft can still fly, but getting to it from land is more than difficult right now. So I ask you, do you think all these deadly acts with peculiar circumstances surrounding them are just random coincidences? Or are we in the midst of something more specific and targeted?
Yes, I see your point. Definitely too many coincidences.
But it doesn't end there. Who do you think was on board the aircraft that mysteriously exploded over the Atlantic?
I'm not sure I want to know.
Vito Indigo, the general said, not waiting for her to finish the sentence. Vito, are you sure? She asked, her face filling with obvious signs of grief.
Yes, we're fairly certain. The tail section was visible long enough for the Coast Guard crew to ID the plane by its registration number. It belonged to Indigo, all right. No doubt about it. Apparently, it was his private jet.
She hesitated, shaking her head. What's going on here, Nate? He took a few seconds to line up his thoughts before he answered her.
I think someone has launched a silent invasion of sorts, removing specifically targeted pieces from the game board. First, they had Redfall's wife eliminate a group of distinguished scientists 2 years ago. Then this red rain appears and blinds us across the board. And it grounds air traffic. Then, another brilliant, resourceful man, Vito Indigo, is taken out. Another scientist of sorts. The same man who owns and controls the internet, as well as the world's largest tech company. Now, we have the president and members of his administration being killed, along with members of Congress.
Who would do this?
I'm not sure. But whoever is behind this is moving very slowly. So much so that nobody has noticed their advance. If I'm right, then my gut is telling me there have been other incidents and deaths that we've missed along the way too. It's also possible that the red rain is part of it all somehow, but I'm not sure if it's merely a distraction or the root cause. There's certainly a sweeping agenda at work here, a carefully plotted and executed master plan, if you will.
Wiggins nodded, her face energizing with anger.
Then we'd better damn well find Hansen, and soon. He must be the key to all this, or he knows who is.
Chapter 12. Slayer brought the van around the side of the house and parked it behind the back patio. The trailer he was pulling was stuffed with wire retrieved from 4 sections of telephone poles located 2 miles west of Pandora. All it took was a quick swipe of their 20-inch Husqvarna chainsaw, and down they came. Diesel had the teeth on that bad boy, chewing through wood like a rabid beaver, though the rotting poles would have probably come down the next time a thunderstorm rolled through the area anyway. Regardless, G had been right. The phone cables came in 100-pair bundles, giving them thousands of linear feet when all said and done.
You get in and lift. I'll pull from the back,
he told Diesel, sitting next to him in the van. Both of them brought their arms up and pulled the hoods of their raincoat over their heads.
Crap! Here comes Dre. We'll need to give him something to do. You know he's gonna ask,
Diesel said, nodding in the direction of the back door to the main house.
I'll think of something,
Slayer muttered, getting out of the van and walking through the rain to the back of the open-air trailer. He pulled the pins on the tailgate and dropped it to the ground, then waited as Diesel climbed inside, working his way to the front. Dre was standing next to Slayer in a flash, yapping about the internet being down again, but Slayer wasn't really listening, a common occurrence when the kid was tagging along. He liked Dre well enough, and their team needed his nimble imagination when it came to his inventions, but the teen was annoying. Dre would slip into these extended diatribes about something new he'd learned that day, then explain it all with a hyped-up delivery that always seemed to work itself into one really long sentence. It was exhausting, to say the least. Other than the occasional pause to take a breath, the boy's lips never seemed to stop. His flappers were always in high gear, like the gills on a fish just pulled from the river. It was all Slayer could do not to grab a handful of Dixie's tampons and jam them into the kid's mouth sometimes. Maybe Dre's incessant jabbering was some sort of survival mechanism, like the fish and its gills. If Dre didn't keep talking, he'd die. The metaphor did seem to fit, though he wasn't sure how to throw the kid back in the water to shut his pie hole. He grinned.
What's so funny?
Diesel asked, talking over top of the rambling Dre.
I'll tell you later,
he shot back, grabbing the leading edge of the first coil. With Diesel's help, they pulled it from the trailer and into the dirt.
Can I help?
Dre asked, taking a break from the conversation with himself to utter the words.
Nah, we got it, sport. Just hang back a little, okay?
Dre nodded and took a sharp step back, slipping back into the explanation about his latest idea for a homemade hovercraft he wanted to build. Well, actually, Diesel would have to build it. Dre would only explain the idea and draw baseline schematics, then Diesel would take it from there, fabricating the materials in their extensive wood and metal shop in barn number 3. Slayer waited for Diesel to hop out of the trailer and grab onto the same side of the wire he was holding. He did, then the two of them dragged it to a spot just short of where Jazz and Kat were working to set up a yellow canopy. He waited for Diesel to let go, then he dropped the wire, making sure to miss his toes. Dre stopped talking for a moment to take a breath, giving Slayer the opportunity to grab the kid's attention. He touched Dre's shoulder and spoke in a gentle voice.
Why don't you stay here and help the girls get the canopy set up? Looks like they could use another pair of hands. I'm sure you can show them how to do it faster.
Okay, cool, thanks, Dre said, resuming his verbal flood, this time aiming it at the girls. Slayer looked at Diesel and rolled his eyes while they went back to the trailer for more wire. Diesel laughed.
Better them than us.
The new guy, Redfall, wanted the girls to construct the 200-square-foot awning and place it over the soon-to-be bonfire location to keep the fire burning in the rain. They were planning to melt the casing from the wire, leaving them with pure copper. Redfall and G were going to use the wire as conductive lashing material in and around the pile of 43 metal screens Wix had saved from the window upgrades a few years ago. The team had also dug around the scrapyard out back and searched the storage room, finding a number of other items that could be used to build makeshift Faraday cages. Metal garbage cans, aluminum siding, sheet metal, aluminum foil, mylar bags, duct tape, an old metal file cabinet, poultry fencing, chicken wire, an old microwave oven, a rusted metal drum, half a spindle of 14-gauge galvanized tracer wire, and some other odds and ends. The plan was to construct shielding around their sensitive equipment to protect it from a burst of microwave. Slayer wasn't sure if he believed everything he'd heard about the Red Rain and its intended purpose, but he told Wix he'd man up and contribute in any way he could.
You seen Dixie?
Diesel asked him a minute later after they'd hauled the third coil to the bonfire pile.
Nope. I'm sure she's around, probably drooling over the new guy. I think she has a crush on Redfall. Have you seen the way she smiles whenever he's around?
I hadn't noticed. Isn't he a little too old for her?
Yeah, but try explaining that to a girl when she's all gaga over some dude, especially a famous one at that.
I don't know if I'd say he's famous.
Well, his wife is, sort of. And he wrote a book. That qualifies.
I guess, Diesel added, grunting to lift the last coil from the trailer. They hauled it to the pile, then stood back with arms folded, watching Kat, Jazz, and Dre finish securing the last leg of the covering. Next up would be the kindling and starter logs to get the coals going before the wire could be cooked.
Do you think it's tall enough?
Jazz asked Slayer, looking up at the canopy.
Should be. With those leg extensions, that's 20 feet?
We should cut reliefs in the top, Dre said, pointing at the center.
To let the smoke out?
Slayer asked.
Yeah, it'll be toxic when the casing melts.
Good idea, Slayer said, turning to Diesel.
Where's that ladder we were using yesterday?
I'll get it. It's around back by the old camper.
Slayer leaned in close to Diesel's ear and whispered, Hey, no stopping in there to rub one out like last Saturday. I moved your smut mags yesterday so Wix wouldn't find them. You gotta be more careful. Diesel's face turned a deep red color, but he didn't say anything. Chapter 13. Simon waited for Wix to unzip the rifle bag containing the hunting rifle Slayer used for small game. She pulled it out and gave it to him. It was an older Model 22 long rifle, wood stock, bolt action, with signs of extensive use. It was my grandfather's, she said. Looks like it, he said, opening the bolt and checking the condition of the chamber, then inspecting the barrel and the rest of the weapon. When was the last time anyone cleaned this? Slayer is supposed to do that. Didn't he? Doesn't look like it. If nothing else, you should run a bore snake through it with a few drops of cleaner after every hunt. Then I'd suggest a complete breakdown and thorough cleaning every 5. I'm not sure I'd rely on this rifle for much, other than to hunt the occasional rabbit. What else do you have? Wyatt didn't leave us much when he left. He knew I wasn't into the whole gun thing, so he took most of the other stuff. she answered, opening the wall safe in the corner and grabbing a plain rectangular box from inside. She gave it to him. I think Grandpa was saving this for something. Simon opened the box and found a pristine .44 Magnum revolver wrapped in a protective cloth. Under it was a certificate of authenticity with a stamped number and signature on it. The number said 212. Wow, I've never seen one of these. It's absolutely gorgeous. I don't think anyone's ever shot it. Simon could see why. I'll say this, your grandfather had great taste. This is an original Elmer Keith .44 Magnum, a rare collectible. Who's Elmer Keith? Simon took the revolver out of the box and held it in his palm, testing its weight and balance. It was heaven in his hand. He's known as Mr. Magnum, the inventor of the .44 Magnum, and famous for his 600-yard shot at a mule deer with an early model of this handgun. I can't believe Wyatt didn't take this one too. Well, we don't have any bullets for it. He likes to shoot things, and when there's no ammo, there's no boom boom. I'm sure that's why he left it behind. Where's your ammo stock? On the top shelf over there, only 3 boxes. Simon's eyes found the boxes from a distance. He now understood G's snide remark earlier about their weapons cache. They didn't have one. He moved to the shelf and inspected the ammo. Inside the first box was about 300 rounds of .22 long rifle. Box number 2 contained 33 rounds of .22 rimfire shorts, and the last held 44 specials. He counted 5 of them, hollow points. Diesel showed up. So did Dixie, all dressed up and decked out, chewing on a length of her hair while staring at Simon.
Fire's burning, Red,
Diesel said, sliding in next to Redfall.
Slayer's helping Cat and Jazz melt the casing from the wire. Looks like it won't take long. It's making a lot of smoke, though. Can probably see it clear to the next county. I keep expecting the fire department to show up to see what's going on.
Simon turned to Wicks, ignoring Diesel's comment for the moment. You do realize 44 specials can be used in a .44 Magnum, right? No, I didn't know that. So we do have ammo? Well, not much. 5 rounds won't go far, he said, holding both a single .44 and .22 round in his hand. Then an idea came to him. He looked at Diesel. Do you have a drill press in your workshop?
Yeah, 2 of them. Why?
What about drill bits? Any metal?
Oh yeah, got tons of them. Plus I have a bit sharpener too. What do you need?
Simon gave Diesel the .22 short. A metal bit that's a hair bigger than the diameter of this round.
Okay, but for what?
Simon held up the .44 special, pointing at the inverted tip. You see how the tip of the bullet is recessed?
Yup, a hollow point.
Simon moved his finger down the casing. I want you to use the drill press and bore it down the middle to about here. It must be perfectly straight and not too deep. You don't want to drill through to the powder, otherwise it's useless. Just drill deep enough so that we can take the .22, turn it around, and stick it inside.
Okay, then what?
You should be able to twist it in about a quarter turn to hold it into place. It needs to be deep enough so it only protrudes out about 1/8 of an inch beyond the end of the .44. It can't stick out too far. Otherwise, when it's loaded into the cylinder, it won't be able to slip past the forcing cone. The idea here is to use the revolver's available chamber space beyond the shorter .44 special for the .22's short rim to stick out and lead the way downrange. I don't understand. What's that gonna do? Dixie asked. Diesel answered her, wearing a smile.
He wants to make an exploding bullet.
Simon was pleased. The kid was sharp and caught on quickly. He's correct. The .22 short is a rimfire cartridge, meaning hard contact anywhere around the rim will set it off. By turning it around and sticking it inside the nose of the hollow point, we are in effect making an explosive round. Really? Absolutely. When the .44 is fired, it'll travel downrange with the .22 stuck inside the main projectile. When the bullet hits something hard, like bone, the rim of the .22 will make contact and fire, sending its bullet the opposite way, penetrating the lead of the .44. That reverse action will make the .44 bullet explode.
That's pretty damn cool,
Diesel said, picking up the revolver too.
Looks pretty easy. Shouldn't take long.
The key is to drill down perfectly straight and not too deep. We only have 5 of these, so no mistakes.
I got it. No worries, Red. I'll take it slow and stop as soon as it's deep enough to slip past the forcing cone.
Excellent. It'll help maximize what we have for defense.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but making exploding bullets can't be legal, Wick said.
No, it's not. In fact, it's a federal offense, but let's face it. If we're correct and a microwave burst is going to bring society to its knees, a new world order will rise in its place. She blinked, but didn't say anything. Simon changed tactics, searching for a better way to get his point across to Wicks, who was staring with deep interest. Look at it this way, Wicks. After the burst takes out most of the electronics, society will be forced to do a hard reboot. When that happens, survival will take on its own momentum and rhythm, if you will. The rules will change as governments fall and social order quickly turns to chaos. At that point, it'll be every man for himself, and that includes the politicians, law enforcement, judges, and attorneys. Everyone will be too busy fending for themselves and their families to give a shit about what we're doing way out here. Trust me, at that point, nobody will care if we have a handful of explosive rounds.
I see your point, Wick said, pinching her lips. But I'm still not sure about this. I don't like the idea of killing anyone, and correct me if I'm wrong, but these bullets are designed to do just that.
Well, yes and no. We could fire them at a car door or body armor, assuming it's a metal plate or ceramic. The explosion won't kill, but it will certainly get someone's attention. It might just give us the time we need to escape, assuming we need a diversion.
Okay, I like that idea better. Go ahead, Diesel. Make the bullets for Red.
You got it, boss,
the kid said, taking the rounds and gun with him when he left the room.
Can I help with something?
Dixie asked Simon. Sure. What can you do? He asked, remembering how skillfully she cut his hair and gave him a straight razor shave.
Well, I'm really good with my hands,
she said in a coy voice, tilting her head and giving him a gentle smile. She ran a fingertip across his forearm. I see, Simon said, feeling a rush of embarrassment. He pulled his arm back, realizing his assumption earlier about why she'd dressed up when they first met in the kitchen was dead on. He needed to diffuse her hormones. How about we all go down to see how G's doing with the shielding? I'm sure he needs lots of help. You know, people with good hands. Her smile disappeared.
That's not what I meant. He knows what you meant, Dixie,
Wick said, turning to Redfall.
Don't take offense. She really didn't mean it.
Oh my God, how embarrassing,
Dixie snapped, turning and storming out of the room.
Sorry about that, Simon.
No worries. She's young and impetuous, he said, secretly appreciating the ego boost. It wasn't often a middle-aged man caught the eye of a young girl, but he'd never go there. Ever.
Still, that shouldn't have happened,
Wicks added. Like I said, no big deal. But I do have to ask. Earlier, you said that everyone at Pandora has special skills. I know Dixie is a hairstylist and is clearly into fashion, but is that all?
She's also our nutrition and fitness guru. Someone has to watch over everyone's health and cardio, 2 things that most camps forget about.
G? Fitness?
Well, sort of. He tries.
That I've got to see.
Plus, Dixie's a genius in the garden. Talk about a green thumb.
I never would have guessed that. Wicks put her hands on her hips, changing the tone of her voice to one of sarcasm.
It takes more than a day or 2 to get to know everyone, Red. Gotta give it some time.
You're right. What about the shy girl, Cat?
She takes care of all the animals. I swear she can hear their thoughts sometimes. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up, though I think she already is. I've seen her perform some pretty amazing surgeries. The animals are lucky to have her, and so are we.
He nodded, impressed. Sounds like you have a fine crew. You should be proud.
Thanks, Simon. I try. But as they all get older, it's getting a lot harder to keep everyone happy.
He smiled, letting his eyes soften. Welcome to the world of leadership. Like you said, gotta give it some time. She shot a grin back, but didn't respond. Let's go see how G is doing, he told her, wrapping a loose arm around her shoulder and leading her out of the room.